This is an enormous pleasure to be able to have time to panel this good at a moment in labor history this significant. We have Justin Rosniak for his first time on the podcast, who's co-host of Well, There's Your Problem podcast, a show about engineering disasters, to talk about the impending potential disaster that's happening with this rail strike. Welcome, Justin.
Hello, thanks for having me.
We have returning to the podcast our WU co-chair, Ross Grooters. I'm really looking forward to see what you have to say about this vote that just happened about 20 minutes ago. Welcome back.
Yeah, happy to be here, Bree.
And also returning to the podcast, Maximilian Alvarez, who, of course, is the host of Working Podcast and the editor-in-chief of the Real News. Welcome back, Max.
Thanks for having me, Bree.
All right, let's start with you, Ross, because boy, oh boy, oh boy. There has been let's start by reading off the statement from the rail workers, to which you contributed a quote, and which I gotta say makes everyone look kind of bad who isn't named Bernard, no middle name Sanders. The statement starts, unfortunately, the most, in quotation marks, most labor-friendly president has opted to side with big business and call for thwarting of railroad workers' right to strike. On Monday, President Joe Biden called upon Congress to adopt legislation that would mandate a contract and end the threat of any legally sanctioned rail strike from happening. This, although railroad workers have voiced a deep desire to strike in recent months, rail unions representing more than 55% of railroad workers have voted down their respective tentative contracts with the rail carriers in recent weeks. Now, over the course of this week, we've seen some interesting figures come forward and say that they actually will not support the kind of forced agreement, including figures like Ted Cruz, which is neither here nor there. And just about 30 minutes before we started recording, there was a vote in the House to see whether or not striking workers are going to be forced to accept this contract. And it passed the House with a number of progressives saying that it had to be passed along with this bill, an amendment that would give some of the terms that the railroad workers are asking for in terms of sick leave. Of course, there's no guarantee that those amendments will actually be a part of the bill when it goes to the Senate. So, Ross, how are you feeling about all this at this stage?
I think we do see a lot of support building, and people have a better understanding now than they did when we were starting this process, even when we had our last conversation just a short time ago. People have a better understanding of how difficult it is to work on the railroad and lead our lives. So this is going to be an ongoing process, regardless of how this contract turns out in Congress. This is just a step in the process, and we've got a lot more work to do going forward. And we're not done, regardless of how it turns out here. We've got to keep pushing for what it is workers on the railroad and workers everywhere need and deserve.
Okay, so what does that mean, though? Because to take a step back, because the railroad industry is so crucial to the functioning of the economy, back in, what was it, the 1920s, they came up with this, rule that basically Congress can decide to break a strike and force workers to return to the table in the interest of the economy. Now, some people might point out that it's because railroad workers are so essential to the functioning of the economy that their strike power is so significant, and that is the whole purpose of having that kind of a strike power. But never mind that. That is the point here. So when this came to a tipping point, and the negotiations came back to a tipping point back in September when we last spoke, Ross, it was Joe Biden who kind of came forward and helped to it was Bernie Sanders that came forward and tried to help to negotiate a tentative agreement that at least prevented a strike from happening right now. Now it's Bernie Sanders that's saying, I'm not going to vote for this in the Senate. I'm not going to vote to basically break the strike or force them to go back to work, rather, if the leave isn't a part of the deal, if the ability to take sick leave isn't a part of the deal. However, are you saying that there's more to, we're going to keep fighting for this because you think that absolutely it's not going to pass regardless because of Bernie Sanders? Are you saying that there's a chance that there will be a wildcat strike and that, in fact, you think that Congress might actually force rail workers back to work?
I guess we don't know how it's going to turn out, and I appreciate Senator Sanders leading the charge and helping rally support in Congress so that we can improve upon the deal. And I guess that's what I'm saying is that regardless of how this turns out, whether or not we get the sick leave or not, the same root issues are going to exist in our workplace on the railroad. We're still going to have understaffing, inadequate staffing. We're still going to have unsafe conditions. We're still going to be fighting to maintain a freight rail system that these billion dollar companies, $1 billion net profit companies are extracting at the expense of our supply chain. And so in order to do that, we're going to have to get people back to work on the railroads and make it a job worth working at.
Yeah, I want to come to you, Justin, because you wrote a great essay in the New York Times back in October in which you traced some of the history as to how the railroads got to be so broken in the first place. Can you walk us through a little bit of how we got to the place where we've had these really dramatic cuts in the labor force and some of the systemic changes in terms of how rail and freight are delivered that caused there to be so much pressure on the individual employees and so much inflexibility in their timelines?
Oh, yeah. So this is sort of a culmination of a long historical process here, which I think really kicked off in the 1960s. You had, after the failure of the largest corporation in America, the Penn Central Railroad, the government had to take all of the Northeast railroads into government ownership just in order for, the entire nation to survive. They didn't want to do it, but they had to. That created a railroad called Conrail, and Conrail, survived largely through, cutting tracks, cutting crews, cutting, locomotives and rolling stock. It was austerity all the way down. It was a nationalized railroad. You'd think that would be something where you would, have more investment, but no, it was all austerity. And this sort of management philosophy propagated. One of the things is through something we call precision scheduled railroading, which in theory is a very good idea. It's good to run trains on schedules, but in practice, it has largely been, more and more and more and more and more cost cutting. There's not much. This has been a long process of, disinvestment, austerity, and you've really seen in the last couple years where the trains have gotten longer. They're going longer distances. There's more delays. Crews are being called at weird hours to go to weird places to take trains to other weird places. It got really bad really quick, but it is a natural continuation of, what a private railroad has to be, which is if you have a private railroad, it's a money-making business. And as bad as the railroads are at, providing for workers or moving things or anything that they're supposed to do, they are very good at making money right now.
Yeah, I mean, to that point, over at The Lever, they did a great write-up a little while ago about, what was it, $200 billion of profit over the last 10 years or so?
That's what's been sent into dividends and stock buybacks, I want to say.
Stock buybacks, that's right. That's right.
And if you were, if you're like, we need a high-speed rail network in America, that's about the amount of money you would want to make that happen.
That's a good parallel here. And maybe I'll go back to you for a second, Ross. I'll come to you in just one moment, Max. How do we have a sense of what the cost would be to these railroad companies? I mean, we have a sense of their profit, right? This is from The Lever, Matthew Cunningham Cook. Railroad CEOs were paid over $200 million as workers suffered. Warren Buffett alone, railroad giant, obviously, his net worth jumped 50% during the pandemic to $100 billion. And the companies themselves have said that their record profits aren't attributable to the workers, and that's why workers aren't being paid more. They said, quote, the companies maintain that capital investment and risk are the reasons for their profits, not any contribution by labor. I mean, are you kind of doing a mental comparison, or are there conversations about the cost of actually satisfying these pretty modest requests for any time off whatsoever against the massive profits that are being, I won't even say earned, but appropriated by management?
I'm not one to run numbers, but I do look at the impact on the lives of myself and my coworkers, and we've seen deaths under PSR increase. We've seen derailments increase. We've seen unsafe conditions as rolling stock and track is going under inspected or less inspected than it used to be because of cuts to labor force. And we see the effect of not having paid sick time with, just here in Iowa, we had, I guess it was maybe Galesburg, Illinois, on the BNSF, we had a worker who died of a heart attack, and he knew he had problems, but was unable to get the time off he needed to address them. And so those to me outweigh any cost to railroads that are already making billions. It's not that they're not making money. They are making extreme amounts of money, and there is never enough. Railroads are turning away business, not because it doesn't make money, but because it doesn't make enough margin for them.
Right, and this was part
That's
of
a problem.
This is part of the PSR, right? The idea that you're doing kind of longer trains, sometimes 3-mile long trains. It's kind of incredible to wrap your mind around that. Instead of stopping and kind of changing out cargo at various stops throughout the country, are basically doing end-to-end runs, which technically, abstractly in theory, would enable you to have more of a regular schedule and have people to be able to anticipate and like coordinate around deliveries. But in fact, has basically meant that people who need to be supplied in between, like different kinds of goods are now prioritized, and people who use the other kind of goods that are no longer profitable, perishables and things like that, are no longer so easily serviced by those train companies and have to rely on trucks. And so there's winners and losers. Am I understanding that right?
Yeah, that's right. And precision scheduled railroading is a bit of a misnomer because the scheduling part is really on the railroad schedule. That's what that means. And the precision is about, it's not about really accommodating workforce or staffing. The precision part of it is how precisely can we cut the operation of the bone to where it functions. And unfortunately, they've cut so deep that when there's one breakdown, it just has a cascading effect, and it has impacts throughout the entire system that cause the freight rail system to not operate the way it should. And it's all rooted in inadequate staffing.
And you have a 3-mile train with, at this point, only 2 people staffing it. When there's a breakdown, the individuals on board have to walk miles potentially to even resolve the problem. And there's a push now for there to be even leaner staffing with either just one human and a kind of a autopilot Tesla type of driving system, without the kind of redundancy that we kind of understand in plane travel and other kind of high risk travel is useful for, in case someone does, for example, have a heart attack like your colleague did.
It's not going to be enough to have the cuts to the workforce where they are and accommodate them with this contract, however that happens. They're going to keep pushing to eliminate people from these jobs. And the end goal is to eventually completely automate the rail network.
So, Max, the politics of this, I mean, stacking up all of the facts that we've elucidated thus far, record profits from the railroad industry, a very sympathetic group of workers who are kind of optically the traditionally vaunted type of kind of hard hat, kind of strong American worker that exists in the public eye. Whatever you think about the validity of those types of stereotypes, they're a sympathetic group. Their demands are incredibly sympathetic. I think in a bipartisan way, everybody that I've heard talk about it, even in the context of Fox News, says that it's remarkable, it's extraordinary, it's bizarre that people wouldn't even be able to guarantee any time off, or to at least have to plan 30 days out for the very limited days off that some people get in the industry. And despite all of that, Joe Biden, having positioned himself as the most labor-friendly president since FDR, is poised to force workers to agree to the government negotiated, the Biden administration negotiated terms that do not include days off. You have Nancy Pelosi doing this kind of double talk where she says, it's outrageous that workers don't have paid sick leave, at the same time saying, well, but the consequences of a shutdown would be catastrophic, so we got to do what we got to do. And then weird bedfellows being made across the aisle, with a handful of Republicans coming forward and saying, actually, we stand with workers, either because they just want to turn the screw against Joe Biden or because they have real solidarity. What do you make of all of this?
What I make of all of it is that it's a lot of pointless theater, right? People can really, demonstrate clearly where they stand and whether or not they stand with workers, right? Labor's enduring question is, which side are you on? I think the political establishment is answering very clearly what side they're on. And to be clear, this is exactly what would happen if it was a Republican president. That's what happened when George Bush was president in 1992. This would very much be, Republicans wouldn't do anything better than this. It was Republican senators who were trying to ram through legislation back in September when we were approaching the end of the cooling off period, after which strikes initiated by the rail unions or lockouts initiated by the rail carriers could legally take place. It was Republican senators who were trying to say, we need to force everyone back to work. We need to force the unions to accept the recommendations from Biden's presidential emergency board as the framework for a new agreement without any, say from the membership. Now, Biden, what the Democrats offered was a couple of sweeteners in that closed door deal that was hammered out in mid-September, including Secretary of Labor Marty Walsh, Pete Buttigieg, carriers and union leaders, and so on and so forth. And then everyone took a victory lap. They praised that a rail strike had been averted. This was before most members of the rail unions ever even saw the text of the tentative agreement. And the media just took the bait and moved on. The media have failed railroad workers so catastrophically throughout all of this.
A rail strike is one of the most disruptive and expensive things that can happen to an economy.
A rail shutdown or strike would disrupt supply chains.
A strike means food prices could skyrocket.
Many experts are saying would be an economic catastrophe.
That could mean a big shortage and massive price hikes. Even gas prices could increase.
And it also could cost the economy $1 billion within the first week.
That would cripple the economy.
I'm not setting aside the concerns of your members, but are you and your members willing to stop the rails, in effect, and accept those costs to the U.S. economy?
Do you believe a strike is worth it if it cripples the U.S. economy and costs up to $2 billion a day?
More than $2 billion per day.
Is it worth it?
And on top of all of that, the holidays are right around the corner.
It's a little less than a month right before Christmas here.
Especially right before the holidays.
President Biden warning, if that happened, it would devastate the economy if we had a strike like that. So joining me now to talk about this and a lot more is Bank of America. It's Brian Moynihan, Chairman and CEO, one of the biggest banks in the world.
It's been such an infuriating process to be covering this relentlessly at the Real News all year, trying to publish extensive interviews with different workers where you can hear people talk about what Ross is saying. Right? Just the incredible duress that people are under because they never get to see their families. They're looking at pictures, wondering how their kids got so old and where they have been this whole time, right? And losing out time with their parents who died of COVID because they were 2 states away and couldn't even have their phone on during their run, right? I mean, we are just absolutely driving. If we call these workers essential, and they are essential, and they have shown how essential they are, not just through the COVID-19 pandemic, but if we are talking about how vital they are to the supply chain, there's a real disconnect here because we're saying you're essential. That's why you need to shut the fuck up, right? That's why, we're not going to give you anything. You just have to stand there and be honored in that public view, the humble railroad worker. This is what true blue working class people look like. But then when it really comes down to it, when it comes to the showdown, we're going to sell them down the river, which is exactly what both political parties are prepared to do right now. And I guess the thing that I would really emphasize, kind of synthesizing what we've been talking about right here, I get, again, understanding very, very well the catastrophic failures of covering this accurately by the corporate media. I understand why so many people didn't know about this before, didn't know there was a crisis on the railroads before, and were understandably freaked out about what a rail strike or rail lockout, though most outlets never mentioned that a lockout is also a possibility. It's only ever posed as a union problem, not a rail carrier problem. But I understand why people were worried about that when you already have high costs, high inflation, a cost of living crisis. You have a supply chain that is already under sagging under the weight of disruptions caused by COVID-19, extreme weather events exacerbated by climate change, the war in Ukraine. But no one has been talking about the ways that corporate greed has driven the supply chain into the ground, which is what we're talking about today. And so that's the real, like screwed up thing here, right? Is that people are now saying, oh, thank God we've averted, quote unquote, a national rail shutdown by having Congress force everyone back to work and force a deal down their throats. We didn't avert anything. Workers just had their strike preemptively broken by POTUS and by Congress. And the people who have already caused the crisis that you as a consumer are already paying for because of their corporate malfeasance, they get off scot-free. That's what I want to emphasize for people. You're going to have the effect of a strike, whether you want one or not. You're already having it because workers are quitting in record numbers because they're being run into the ground. They're dying on the job, like Ross said, because they're being treated like faceless meat bags who don't have human dignity and don't deserve time off to live a life outside of work. We are already destroying the supply chain for the sake of Wall Street profits. And as I said, you are already paying for it. The ports are backed up to shit. You can't unload all of that on trucks. It's just not feasible. But that doesn't matter for the business model as long as Wall Street is making its money. It doesn't matter that the quality of service has been plummeting. The quality of life for workers on the railroads has been plummeting. Prices, price gouging for shippers has been going through the roof, while stock buybacks and dividends have also been going through the roof. This is a crisis that is already here, that you're already paying for, and that's going to get worse because, as workers like Ross have been telling me repeatedly, if this is the result we're going to get, most people knew that this was going to happen. A lot of people might have voted down the tentative agreement and voted to strike if they felt that Congress wasn't going to just pull the rug out from under them at the last second. A lot of people probably do want to fight, but they don't think that anyone's going to actually let them do it or that the public will be behind them when they do. And so what a lot of people have told me is I'm out. I'm leaving. I can't make it to retirement under these conditions. So you're going to have the effect of a strike when more and more workers leave, more and more trains lie, on the tracks, and products don't get shipped. Ports continue to get backed up, and all of that is going to be costs that are going to be passed on to you. And the rail carriers are essentially using it to deliberately destroy their workforce so that they can push through their long sought after goal of getting one-person crews on these massive trains that put all of us at hazard, because you have derailments where toxic chemicals like chlorine are leaking out and could wipe out an entire community. But if you got one fucking person on that train, you're not going to be able to contain that mess in time. Right? They are putting all of us at danger. They're destroying the supply chain for the sake of profit. That crisis has not been addressed at all. And it is workers and all workers who are going to suffer for that.
Yeah. I mean, Justin,
if I can,
please. Oh. No, please go ahead. Go ahead, Ross.
No, I appreciate it. Your question was about the politics of it. And while that's important in this moment that Congress is taking action or important with quotation marks, but I just want to mention how we got here was because we had union workers from 4 rail unions stand up and say enough is enough and say no. And 4 unions that represent about 55% or more than 55% of unionized rail labor in this country stood up and said, no, enough is enough. And we need better. We need to get relief from what is happening. And that's why we're here. It's not because of political action that we got to this point. It's because of worker action and them standing up for their rights. And just as Max, took us to church and explained in that great monologue, that's what we're fighting over. This is much deeper than just the contract, the terms on a piece of paper for our work. It's much, much more systemic than that.
Yeah, I mean,
and that's a long fight.
Honestly, it feels, and people have been alluding to this, like this could be a tipping point that extends well beyond real workers and real worker unions in particular. because it is so it's so exemplifying so many of these stressors that are the result of austerity politics, of corporate greed, of diminished labor union capacities across the country over the last 30 to 50 years, et cetera, et cetera. And this is one of the few sectors where workers do have that modicum of power. And there's this really interesting tension that's being set up between the unignorable power in terms of their essential nature to the economy that rail workers have, and the fact that it's being counterbalanced by this quirk of history, this Railway Labor Act, which allows Congress to intervene to diminish said power. And I think it's a really important lesson right now for so many Americans as to the entire point of having organized labor and to how far politicians will go who are not, people backed, how far corporate politicians will go to maintaining the status quo in a way that is not bipartisan, is not partisan at all, which is why I am interested in the politics of it, because I do think this is a crystallizing moment for people to see that when you have, Ted Cruz coming out saying that he was against crushing this labor action. The alliance, it seems nonsensical. It does seem to be completely about Joe Biden. And there was someone else, was it John Cornyn, who had said some sympathetic remarks and then today flip-flopped and said, well, actually, no, we can't have rail stoppage.
Marco Rubio too. Yeah.
Marco Rubio too. Yeah. At a certain point, it becomes very clear, at least from my perspective, and hopefully increasingly to, average voters' perspective, that this isn't about Democrats being good guys, Republicans being bad guys, or vice versa. The only one here who seems to have had any consistency at all is Bernie Sanders. Even these squad members, and I'm curious what you guys think of this, what you all think of this. There was a lot made of Pramila Jayapal having negotiated this amendment that would provide workers with the paid the leave request, at least, what was it, 7 days in her amendment of leave, and that she had figured out a way to get those things passed concurrently in the House so that you couldn't vote for the negotiated the temporary agreement, the negotiated agreement, whatever you call it, to be passed to force people to keep working without actually giving them the significant part of the demands that they were demanding. But that means nothing at the Senate. No, that means nothing about whether or not that's actually going to be passed in the Senate.
Correct. Yeah, I mean, it's I call them the infrastructure shuffle, right? It's like you create this kind of like secondary bill that promises to sort of achieve what the first bill can't. People are momentarily placated, even though everyone in Congress knows it's dead on arrival. This is what I mean when I say this is a bunch of theater. Like, yeah. I would love for Marco Rubio to have a come to Jesus moment. I've already seen his like pro-labor proposals. He wants to like bring back business unions. Fuck you. Like, you're not pro-union, right? And right now it's very low stakes for someone like Rubio to say he sides with workers. Again, show me what your voting record is. Show me what you are actually planning to do to help these people that you keep calling essential. Show me that you actually had the cojones to take on these billionaires who are driving our critical supply chain into the ground and holding it hostage. That's another thing to say, to point out, right? Everyone's talking about how much power, and we're talking about it now, how much power workers on the railroads have, which they do, which is great and essential. But rail carriers have that power too. Both sides have the power to like grip a key part of our infrastructure, of our supply chain, and bring it to a halt. But we only ever talk about the labor side. We don't talk about the fact that the rail carriers have been holding the economy hostage this whole time, which is exactly what they did a week before the deadline in September, when lockouts and strikes could officially begin.
Remind us, Max, what do you mean by lockouts?
Yeah.
What can potentially happen?
Well, Ross, do you want to take that? I mean...
Sure, I could be out of work. Well, we're in a cooling off period, but let's say we weren't in a cooling off period that was negotiated. The rail carriers themselves could choose to lock the doors and refuse to allow workers to go to work. That's a lockout, and that could have happened at several points throughout this process. And essentially, it really did in September when rail carriers were stopping freight and refusing to move it. It was maybe what referred to as a soft lockout, where workers are still working, but they're not doing all the work that they would be, and cars are embargoed, which we're now seeing Surface Transportation Board hearings where rail carriers are being called to answer for cars being embargoed now just because they don't have the workforce to move the cars.
So basically, sorry, go ahead.
Well, it just, yeah, I think.
So basically, the rail companies are saying, "Oh, you think you're going to strike? Oh, you think you're going to withhold your labor for more pay or time off or things like that? I'll do you one better. I'm going to preemptively say you can't come to work, and I'm basically going to count on the fact that you need the money more than I need the money, and I need to actually move this cargo, and let you know that I'm like kind of preemptively I can hold out longer than you. I'm not going to play ball." Is that kind of the posture of it?
Well, it depends.
For the railroads, it's not, because the railroads have the power of the Railway Labor Act that you've been talking about, where Congress will step in and act. So if the railroads declared a lockout, Congress would intercede and stop the lockout.
I see.
Yeah, that's the thing I was going to say, is that what the rail carriers are saying, they're not talking to the unions. They're talking to Congress. They're saying, like, even if I slow shit down like they did illegally in September, right? Because there was not a day of productivity lost in the lead up to the strike or lockout deadline in September from the labor side. Labor has played everything by the rules. There were no strikes leading up to the deadline. They were waiting until it was legally allowable. The rail carriers, however, started embargoing freight. They started closing down certain lines. Amtrak started shutting down commuter lines that used the freight lines and so on and so forth. So they were holding the economy hostage. They were squeezing it for Congress, saying, like, this is what will happen if you don't give us everything that we want, right? That is the position that the rail carriers are in, and they know it. And this goes even farther back. This is like, if we're talking about the politics of it, the politics are so mismatched to what is needed, because as always, we are sacrificing long-term solutions to systemic problems for short-term political gain. That is what's happening. Everyone's talking about, like, oh, a supply chain disruption before Christmas. My God, like, what could that possibly mean? Again, no one's talking about the fact that we're already paying higher prices for all the corporate malfeasance. No one talks about the fact, for example, remember 2 years ago, there was that train in Los Angeles that got looted and everyone was like, oh my God, crime is running rampant. This is nuts. 2 weeks before that happened, Union Pacific did another round of layoffs. This is caused by the corporate malfeasance that we're talking about. They are fucking you over because they know that they can, and they know that Congress and the president are going to give them everything they want. And I want people to really understand, it's because this result was almost always a written into, the stars, and the rail carriers knew it, that they felt they did not have to bargain in good faith for the past 3 years. Workers have gone without a real contract, and they have gone without a good faith bargaining at the bargaining table over things like paid sick leave, like two-man crews or one-man crews and stuff like that. It's just been stonewall. Why? Because the carriers knew if it got to this point, the ace in their back pocket was Congress and Biden forcing everyone back to work. And so they don't have to negotiate in good faith, because they know they're going to get everything that they want. So the short-term focus of our politics is part of what has created this long-term crisis that no one, again, has the cojones to actually resolve.
I'd point out too quickly in this agreement is it's not all agreed to at this point. Some of this is agreeing to go back to the bargaining table and negotiate something that's not entirely spelled out, and have binding arbitration when that reaches an impasse. And I say when that reaches an impasse because I don't have faith that the carriers will bargain in good faith there. So we've been asked to accept something that's not even written down in writing for our working conditions. And so that's not talked about enough, but it is kind of goes to what Max is saying, where the railroads don't have to negotiate in good faith.
Well, I guess maybe this is a naive question, but how much of a difference would it make if Joe Biden were a person that was going in these negotiations and saying we're not going to, Congress is not going to stop this. I will not vote for the agreement to stop this. That I'm not going to intercede on behalf of these railroad companies, that you have to negotiate in good faith, because the thought experiment that many people are running through, on the left at least, is what would be happening differently if Bernie Sanders were president. Is this really, the left being unduly angry at Joe Biden, or are there real tangible differences that would accrue if someone who was actually the greatest labor president since FDR were in that position? I mean, is Joe Biden, do you have any sense, Ross, that Joe Biden is pushing at all, advocating at all for the sick leave piece in particular? It just seems like such a no-brainer for the sick leave piece to be considered more seriously and taken up by the railroad corporations.
Actions speak louder than words, and I think we've seen Bernie Sanders as somebody who's willing to take action and go to bat for workers. We haven't seen that from the Biden administration, at least, especially when it comes to this rail issue.
Yeah, Justin, I want to come back to you and talk a little bit more about how we got here. I mean, one point that you raised earlier was that there was this moment where the industry was at least partially nationalized, that there were flagging profits in the Northeast and that the railroad companies weren't sustainable. And at that point, we got, what was it, Conrail?
Conrail, yes.
Innovated. But that, instead of kind of like the sanguine story that we tell about nationalization, and that we would hope to be the case, at least from a left perspective, you got austerity. What happened there? And then what does that mean for leftists or others who might be imagining that nationalization could be a solution for some of these longer term problems?
These were corporations which were set up to, this corporation was set up with the express intention that, all right, this is a temporary fix. We are going to return the railroad to profitability, and the main concern is profitability. It's not about service. It's not about workers' rights. It's not about blah, 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 blah. It's like, this company needs to make a profit, and this is the only thing. And Conrail was very successful at that. It only took like, it still took like a decade to turn around, but it turned around, and no one thought you could turn it around in that amount of time. And so, if where you're looking at, this becomes sort of a model for the rest of the railroad system. It's just profits. This is not good if you're, let's say you advocate for railroad nationalization. I would not say the Conrail model is a very good one. I think you'd have to go for something which is more designed around service, as opposed to designed around making money, because, it's great to make money, but what if you actually did the thing that you're supposed to do, which is move things from point A to point B?
Yeah.
Well, and imagine, if you will, we had an interstate system that was built around making money. There would be places in this country that would not be served by the interstate.
Right.
It wouldn't make a profit. We would be, losing money on that investment. And the freight rail system should be treated as the public infrastructure it is. Yeah.
Or, UPS, which is also not UPS, USPS, which is also being defunded for similar reasons, for these, it's not sufficiently profitable, so we're not going to do it sort of reasons, which is, really stripping at the core of what makes America great, for lack of better parlance here. And it is very disappointing that's, yeah, go ahead, Justin.
Oh, I was going to say there was an effort in the late 80s where Conrail's union attempted to buy Conrail because they were the only credible bidder. So you could have had a worker-owned railroad back in the 80s, and did not happen because the executives in charge decided we should not have a worker-owned railroad. That would be uncompetitive. It would be too good.
That's incredible. Because I was going to say, the lesson here is in part that when we talk about nationalization, worker ownership is the piece of the story that often gets left out. When people try to hand-wring and awfulize about, authoritarian government examples across the globe, the pushback the left tries to offer is, okay, but it's not just that it is nationalized, is that it's worker owned. It's not just that it's not corporatized, it's that it's worker owned. Because of course, any you can have a kind of authoritarianism in a lot of different kinds of contexts, unless the economics are democratized as well. So we were on the precipice of actually having a worker owned rail system.
Yes, at least in the Northeast, it was they were the only credible bidder back in the 80s. They were, it would have been owned essentially by, I think, the Union Pension Fund. So not directly worker controlled, but it would have been, it's something, right?
An improvement on the mean.
It's much better. And once you're outside of that profit motive, oh my God, you can do so many things.
Well, and like just to kind of piggyback on that, because I think this is a really important vein that we're hitting here that goes to Ross's point, right, about how this is much bigger than the railroads. This is much bigger than one contract fight, right? This is a societal problem that we are confronting, that working people are confronting. We are at an inflection point here, right? Because the labor movement is also, reaching the sort of ends of institutionality in many ways, right? Because if you follow the prescribed protocols as rail workers have done throughout this whole 3-year process, and then you just end up here where Biden and Congress ripped the rug out from under you after those 3 years, then then what do you do, right? What's the point of the whole process? What was all that show of workers having a democratic say on this in the past? Why did we even bother with that, right? But on top of that, we look at the rest of we survey the rest of the landscape here, right? We have, more union election filings this year than we did last year. We have more strikes this year than we did last year. And yet the NLRB is saying they're going to have to lay people off because their budget hasn't been raised in 9 years. They can't keep up with all the unfair labor practices charges that are coming in as Starbucks breaks the law flagrantly in front of everyone, fires union organizers, closes unionized stores because they know how overburdened the NLRB is. And so what you're seeing is a dramatic drop in new union election filings from Starbucks Workers United. They are having the intended effect because workers are going through the proper channels. Businesses are breaking all the rules. So then it's like, what do we do? Do we just give up? This is a real important moment for the rest of the labor movement. I think it's going to be incumbent upon all of us, union and non-union workers, to recognize that we are fighting a lot of the same people and we are fighting against a lot of the same systemic ills, right? Because I think that Justin made a really, really crucial point, right? This is what the railroads look like. This is what anything looks like. I think one of the mental leaps that people have to make is well, I know what the railroads should do. So are they doing it? But what you need to understand is that to the Wall Street investors who own these railroads, they don't give a shit about what the railroads are supposed to do. Again, the financialization of everything means turning everything into money-making widgets. It doesn't matter what the service is. That is why in so many other realms of consumer life, you are seeing the quality of products go down. You are seeing so much, the quality of service in so many different areas go down because this is what they're doing. This is why Starbucks are piled up with at-home orders that workers can't possibly fill. Starbucks doesn't care if you come to pick up those orders. They only care if the money goes in to their bank account. They don't care that they're understaffing their stores and can't keep up with the demand, because the main purpose is not to provide good coffee for customers or a good workplace for workers. It's just to squeeze as much money out of this institution that they have control over. It's happening to Major League Baseball, right? I mean, it's everywhere. And then what we need working people to understand is that the more that we band together and articulate these demands in clear, concise ways, the more that we can actually go on the offensive, because this sort of understaffing, this sort of piling more work onto fewer workers crap, I hear it in so many places from so many different workers that I talked to. Last year, the longest nurses strike in Massachusetts state history was at St. Vincent Hospital, which is owned by an investor-owned Tenet Healthcare, which is located in Texas. And they were doing the same shit that the rail carriers are doing to their rail workers. They were eliminating predictable scheduling. They were piling more work onto fewer nurses so that their nurse-to-patient ratio was unmanageable, and thus they couldn't provide the level of care that they had been trained to give, just like workers are trying to give the level of service that they've been hired to do, but can't when they're going up against all of these odds. Teachers are dealing with class loads of over 30 students, they're being called essential, but also being vilified in the media and told to shut up, painted as groomers, what have you, right? Chipotle workers are being chronically understaffed. And then when they fight to unionize, like workers did in Maine to improve their workplaces, Chipotle closed the goddamn store on them, just like Starbucks is doing right now. Dollar store workers, people have probably gone into a Dollar General and noticed that the shelves are half empty. It looks like chaos. There's one or two people, poor employees running around. That is by design. That is the same sort of corporate mentality of understaffing and under-resourcing the people actually on the front lines making the business run, because as long as you turn a profit, that's all that really matters. And so the last thing I would say, just to kind of put that into perspective on the railroads, what people also need to understand, and what you should definitely go check out Justin's work if you want greater context on this, right, is that from like the 1980s to now, there used to be over 500,000 workers on the freight railroads. Over 4 decades, that has been slashed to nearly 130, right? Since 2015 alone, the Class 1 freight rail carriers have eliminated over 30% of their workforce. They have done this on purpose. And now they're complaining about that they can't hire enough people. It's like, motherfucker, you fired all of them. Right. And that is also why they have to institute these draconian attendance policies, because in the past, if Ross wanted to say, like, you know what, I'm too tired, I'm going to mark off, I can't take my next shift, there would be people waiting in the wings to pick up that shift and get on that train. But they have essentially cut labor as close to the bone as they can, that there aren't any reserves left. So that is why workers can't take time off, or they get penalized so heavily if they do, because this is like trying to operate at the very bare minimum as far as labor costs goes. All of that is put on the shoulders of workers like Ross, who are run into the ground because of it. And we're not doing anything to address it. And this is like, we need working people to actually see that this is part of this is corporate America's plan for all of us. And workers are the ones who are actually trying to take a stand against this. And Republicans and Democrats in Congress are trying to cut their legs out from under them.
Yeah. I mean,
I don't want to.
Yeah, go ahead.
I didn't want to interrupt Max when he was on such a roll, but Bree, you mentioned this word, and I want to put a finer point on it. Is when I hear or read nationalization, I change that up in my mind and substitute democratization. And that's the way I want to think about when we talk about railroad nationalization. We're talking about democratizing the workplace. We're talking about democratization of our industry, and that can be beneficial all over. If you look at Starbucks, for example, maybe we'd have our eggnog lattes this season if the workers were running the show.
Yeah, I mean, Justin, you mentioned this in an episode I heard you join on the Antifada recently. Talking about the potential implications of so many pensions investing soon. I mean, I feel like this relates back to Max's point, where there doesn't seem to be a lot of reserves. They've basically created a shallow bench. They've made it an industry that people don't want to train and get into because they see how the current workers are treated. It used to be a good middle class job, and they're stretching everybody so thin now. What are the implications? Help me understand the implications of the timing of this pension investment system, and whether there's going to be some kind of cliff coming up soon where you expect there to be a lot of people who basically retire.
A lot of folks are hired on in 2004. A lot of those folks are going to leave in 2024. So it might get ugly.
For the rail corporations,
for the railroads, because I believe, and Ross, correct me if I'm wrong, you get railroad retirement at this point,
potentially, yes.
If
you could qualify for railroad disability or railroad retirement at 20 years.
Okay, so
depending on your circumstances.
If you can get out, a lot of people are getting out of the industry. I will say everyone I know who worked for the railroad has either gotten out of the railroad or they work for Amtrak or Alaska Railroad now, which are much nicer places to work.
So what does that mean? I mean, I know we're not supposed to necessarily be saying things like wildcat strike, or even solidarity strike. Is this one of those areas where solidarity strikes are legal or no?
Well, it seems to be no strike is going to be legal.
So, I mean,
I guess I'd characterize it the way Joe Burns, who's a labor lawyer and author, would say that there isn't anything that is an illegal strike. There are only unsuccessful strikes.
Huh. Okay. So in the event that there were to be a strike, it does seem to me that the fact that there are not a lot of people who could, that they could find to cross the picket line, even if they tried that could successfully fill in, suggests that the power of the strike is even greater, even more extraordinary, that it's going to really, truly grind the country to a halt. And as you pointed out, just in the beginning of your New York Times piece, among the disasters that could ensue from a strike are power plants that will lack the coal needed to produce electricity and water treatment plants that will lack chemicals needed to provide clean water. Grocery shelves could go empty. It's the holidays, blah, blah, blah. It seems so odd to me that the railroad companies, that the government would be playing chicken in a situation where the deck really does seem to be stacked for workers, assuming, of course, that they have the support, strike funds, et cetera, to hold out for any length of time.
And well, you are in a situation where railroad workers are relatively well paid. You have you have a lot of worker power. I mean, railroad workers could go on strike and give everyone cholera if they wanted to, just because there'd be no chemicals at the water treatment plant. But this is it's also you have sort of a historically conservative union culture there. I would say.
How do you mean?
Well, BLET is not it's not it is not the it has never been like these your balkanized craft unions. How do you say? I'm not a railroad worker. I'm not speaking for anyone, but it's a lot of these rail unions have been on the more conservative side for a long time, and a lot of really super radical labor action has not happened in a long time.
So that's Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainsmen.
Yes.
And there are like 12 separate unions that are involved in this?
Yes, there's 12 craft unions.
And it's 4 that have held out and said they aren't going to accept this Biden administration negotiated agreement.
Yes.
And I'd just like to point out that one of them is BMWED, who invested, their leadership invested in rank and file organizing of their membership. And I'd suggest that that's one of the reasons that they've held out and pushed forth demands of paid sick time, is because they have spent that time because they've had the foresight and the militancy within their leadership, the vision, if you will, to organize internally themselves in order to be able to be poised for a moment like this. And that isn't happening in most of the railroad craft unions.
I was genuinely surprised at BMWED, because they seemed like they got a really good deal, and especially in Norfolk Southern, where they got rid of the camp cars finally, and they voted it down. It was like,
well,
yes.
What are the camp cars? Camp cars.
You have these really terrible railroad cars where if you're a maintenance away guy, these are like just dormitories on rails. Norfolk Southern was still using them, and every other railroad would put you in a hotel, but Norfolk Southern was still using the camp cars, and their deal got rid of the camp cars. They would get a hotel, and that seemed like a really good deal to me, which is like why I was surprised they voted it down, but of course very happy they voted it down as well.
Yeah, I mean, some people will look at this and say, okay, only 4 out of the 12 trade unions are holding strong here and saying that they don't want to accept this negotiated agreement. That represents a minority. Of course, that they represent 55, a majority of actual rail workers. And I did want to ask you, Justin, some more about why you think, and you too also, Ross, obviously, why do you think, what do you think is determining these outcomes? Is it just leadership is more radical? Is it that different unions have different goals, have been offered different deals, are in more or less strenuous conditions, have more or less accessibility to days off.
Do you want me to go first, Justin?
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Well, I mean, my view is I'm in the operating craft, so conductors and engineers is who I primarily work with. And I heard from a lot of people that they felt like because of the political situation, this was the best they could do. So they voted yes for it.
Because of the political situation, that situation being that Congress is poised to railroad them, for lack of a better word.
Correct. And there's concern because Congress, we're seeing Congress step up and add paid sick time. They could have just as easily given us an even worse deal. And so there's that fear. You know, you have the pundits and politicians and the rail carriers who are strong arming this process. And so I think there are a number of people that think this contract is not good, but voted for it because of that fear.
Let me ask you this: but Bernie Sanders says he's not going to vote for this, meaning that he would stop it at the Senate level if the deal doesn't include these sick time days. I'm curious, is what Bernie is demanding actually satisfactory? Is there a universe where even Bernie is kind of short selling what could be negotiated? Like, is there a world where Bernie says, okay, I'll vote for it, and the resolution to stop further negotiation ends up passing and signed by the president, even though it's short of what the unions would have negotiated if they had been able to do so without government interference?
We need the same thing. I mean, Max has highlighted this. We need the same things that all other workers do in our workplaces. And whether or not Bernie Sanders is coming up short, the fact is that we're failed by the entire process. We're failed by leadership at every level. It doesn't, to me, it doesn't cover what we need to get to, but it is a step in the right direction. And it shows that we can fight. It shows that we can resist. It shows that not only can we do these things, we need to do these things or we're not going to win. We need to think about how we're going to do this differently going into the next round of negotiations and how we're going to position ourselves to fight back, or we're going to end up with the same result.
So you sound like you're kind of confident that there is going to be another round of negotiations, that you're not going to get stymied by this congressional resolution.
We're going to get. I think Congress will step in and enact enact this contract so there's not a labor stoppage. But we've been without a contract for 3 years, and this is only a 5-year deal. So that means we're reigniting, we're jump-starting this process again in just 2 years, which is right around the corner.
The implications of that, though, even if the best version of events happens and the kind of the Bernie style resolution gets passed, you're still negotiating now in a world where your possibility is limited by the horizon set by Bernie Sanders, which could be a good horizon, but isn't necessary. Do you know what I'm saying? Isn't necessarily coterminous with the horizon that you would be negotiating for, absent the ability for Congress to intercede.
I'd argue that horizon was set for Bernie Sanders by what he was hearing from rail labor.
Oh, I see. Okay. I mean, that's good to hear. I mean, Max, I want to come back to you about some of this political stuff as we're wrapping up here. It was just confirmed today that Hakeem Jeffries is the next leader, minority leader, House minority leader. There was jockeying, apparently, or some presumption that there would be jockeying for Pramila Jayapal to be in that role. And then we've seen repeatedly stories that characterize her as shepherding the interests of the left, even though she seems consistently to stop just short of actually doing anything that manifests in any material benefit for everybody. And this latest case where there was all of this applause for her having gotten this amendment, including all of the sick leave stuff, passed along with the the mailing resolution in the House. Your point about it being political theater, do you have any confidence that this is a moment that increasingly we're being confronted with moments where the public at large better understands, whether they're leftists that are disillusioned or Republicans that are disillusioned or liberals that are disillusioned, that this is one big club and none of us are in it?
I think so. I would say, just giving my honest kind of gut reaction to that. Like I said, my job is to interview workers about their lives, jobs, dreams, and struggles. And this comes up a lot. I mean, like, more and more people are convinced that there is no real political divide, that when it comes to, the lives and dignity of working people and maintaining the sort of, system of corporate pillage that is concentrated decision-making power and wealth in the hands of a few, that no one's really going to do anything to stop that. But as I think I mentioned earlier, there are real tangible things that Democrats can do here, and they really need to do something because they keep racking up a terrible reputation for working people who don't forget all the times that they've been betrayed by them. Again, apologies if I'm repeating myself, but I still have people saying, we remember when Obama promised or campaigned in 2008 promising to push through the Employee Free Choice Act. And then he dropped it like a bad habit as soon as union workers helped get him elected. We remember when Obama and the White House did absolutely nothing when Scott Walker was taking a battering ram to public sector workers and ramming through Act 10 and then turning Wisconsin into a right to work state a couple of years later. Democrats just sat by and watched that happen. They have also not made the PRO Act a priority. It went through the House and has just sat and died in the Senate. It has not been, like a priority for Democrats, even though, as every person I've talked to has repeated, like, it would absolutely revolutionize labor relations in this country. That labor relations are so stacked in favor of the bosses, labor law is so stacked in favor of the bosses. We can't go into all the reasons why, but you mentioned one, like when we look at labor's heyday in the 1930s and early 40s, right? When we look at all labor was able to accomplish under like very intense circumstances, a big part of that was when you saw entire cities essentially go on general strikes because like textile workers were going on strike. And then you had mill workers saying, you know what, we're going on strike too. And the bosses were shitting their pants, as were the people in DC. And so what did they do? They rammed through Taft-Hartley as soon as they had the votes for it in the 1940s that essentially made that kind of action illegal, right? And that is why we can't do legally by the proper channels, the sort of sympathy strikes that we saw in that time period. Now, the PRO Act wouldn't, I don't believe it would counteract that, but it would open up a lot of doors that were closed with Taft-Hartley over half a century ago. But again, that has not been a priority. I already mentioned that the NLRB, in many ways, the beating institutional heart for supporting the labor movement is on life support right now, to the point that they may actually have to start laying off people because they can't keep up. Their budget hasn't been raised. People in labor all look at this. They're like, okay, you say you're pro-labor, you say you're the most pro-labor, pro-union administration in a generation. Yeah, there are some arguments to be made. Like there were like job creating measures that Biden rammed through with the COVID relief package, with the CHIPS Act. Like those do mean jobs and union jobs in certain parts of the country. But when it comes to supporting workers' ability to fight for what they need, when it comes to actually, empowering workers, that is where the Democrats keep failing people. That is where they are showing that they are not actually serious, because you end up in situations like these, right? Where workers actually are forcing you to make, a politically unpopular decision. It would be politically unpopular to say, I'm not going to get involved in this. These workers deserve what they're fighting for, and the rail carriers need to get serious at the bargaining.
Would it, Max, be politically unpopular? Because it feels like that's actually, in this moment, the politically popular to say, even if it's like not politically expedient in terms of campaign dollars and your interests to your donor, your corporate donor base. But like that's what's so incredible. I was watching a segment on Fox the other day where one of the hosts, she was interviewing a worker, and it was incredibly sympathetic. I mean, there was no bickering about the deservedness of sick days or the deservedness of pay or anything like that. And I think it's partly because the requests are just so reasonable and basic, and it's an industry that people have a lot of respect for. And so whatever pivot that you could try to do a quick pivot and turn rail workers into baristas, but it's going to take more than this media cycle for them to accomplish that. So there's no one really against it. Like, I mean, even the people in Congress, Nancy Pelosi, when she says, "Oh well, I guess we gotta force their hand," she first gives lip service to the value of the worker and how unconscionable it is that they're working in these conditions, but then says, "I guess we just got to do it. We just got to do it so that Christmas gifts arrive on time." It's still and I think that the fact that they have to cloak it in this is like as though they're being their hand is being forced really demonstrates that public opinion is so solidly with the workers in a way that, frankly, I can't think of a parallel that I've witnessed. Even as we've been seeing the Starbucks worker and the enthusiasm for the teacher strike some years ago and all of those things, this feels different.
It is interesting that if you are a big burly manly man railroader, or you are a woke blue-haired Starbucks barista, you have basically the same complaint, which is about scheduling. It's weird.
Yeah, no, it was funny. One of the tags, I think the last time you were on, Ross, the episode was titled something that was like a joke about pumpkin spice lattes for exactly that reason. It came up on the show, and I don't know. It frustrates me. In some ways, it's like very optimistic to feel the energy being so supportive in a bipartisan way. And another way, it's very demoralizing because even in this context, I can very well see the path toward everybody getting away with this and Congress voting for this resolution and nobody blinking an eye, partly because of the coverage reasons that you were talking about before, Max, and partly because even though some of the coverage, including on Fox, is sympathetic, it doesn't contemplate the possibility of what could be done. No one out loud on mainstream media says sympathy strike, general strike, wildcat strike. No one on like a mainstream network will call for or let the audience know this is where you can give money to help support a strike fund or what have you. Like, that is not the posture of the average American. And we're so far away from having a more densely unionized population for people to actually know how all of this works, that I think people are just living in this world where they know something's wrong, but they actually don't even really understand what the path to improvement would necessarily even look like.
Yeah, I think that's right. And two things I would say on that point, maybe three, if I can squeeze the third one in. But the first thing, right, is that the answer to this question in many ways depends on the stakes of taking the positions that we're talking about. Like I said, Marco Rubio is in a cushy position right now because at this point, it doesn't really matter what his vote is. So he can kind of like, say what he wants, get like, some fawning media coverage. But when it actually comes time to like put up or shut up or lead some sort of charge that may, lose him popularity in his own district or within his own party, but actually requires him to stand up firmly for working people and to actually back that with legislation, not just nice words, then we'll see how committed he really is to this type of, support for workers. Now, so I don't know. I could always be surprised. I think that you're right. I think that the door's wide open for people on both sides of the political aisle. If they were smart, they would look at the fact that unions are more popular now than they've been in any of our lifetimes, right? So like, if you want to try to build popular support, there you go. Like, there's a great slam dunk, like sympathize with workers, stand up for workers. The public does as well. Now, here's the sort of like tough talk I would give to the public, to people who I do believe genuinely care for their fellow workers and who want to see a rising labor movement, who want to see the grassroots, the rank and file actually be the ones advancing these solutions, like Railroad Workers United coming out with the plan to nationalize the railroads. That's an incredible genius like idea that has emerged from out of the rank and file. It's not something that was proposed by people in Congress, right? Working people can run this shit and should be running this shit, but we'll save that for another time. What I want to say to the public, and what I've been saying on my show, Working People, here at the Real News, and at my segments at Breaking Points. It was actually, I think, the first segment I ever did for Breaking Points when I started doing the Art of Class War over there, was I begged people to fight against the sort of time warp that we are in this country, that the media puts us in, that our political attention spans put us in. We are operating in a sort of ecosystem that is fundamentally antithetical to building long-lasting solidarity with one another. And I'll explain what I mean. If we are going to talk about people supporting the rail unions if they decide to go on a wildcat strike, my question is, for how long and how many, right? Because what I am saying to people, and this is not to dissuade people from doing that, this is to say, if we are actually asking railroad workers to trust us enough to have their backs when they step out on that line, knowing that it's illegal, knowing that Congress is going to look for any chance to fire them, knowing that the police are going to be there, if we are asking them to trust us to support them when it counts the most, then where have we been for the 1,000 coal miners in Alabama who've been on strike for over 600 days? Right-wing Fox News media hasn't said jack shit about them, even though they love every election cycle going and talking to the humble coal miner and talking about the Democrats are going to kill their jobs. You've had people in deep red Alabama holding the line for almost 2 years now, and right-wing politicians, right-wing media, and most Democratic politicians and liberal media haven't said shit about them, even though they too are the archetypal blue-collar, coal-covered worker. Everyone's let them by the wayside. So, if we are asking railroad workers to trust us, then have we showed up enough for the folks at Warrior Met Coal? CNH industrial manufacturing workers have been on strike for 7 months in Iowa and Wisconsin. It is getting cold on the picket line. The holidays are approaching. The bosses are trying to starve them out and hope that, as the holidays approach, they just give in and accept a deal that no one wants to accept. Where has the media been? Where have politicians been? Where has the public been? Right? And as far as the Starbucks things go as well, we get excited when a new store files for a union election, and we celebrate when they win it outright. But then we disappear as those screws get tightened, as Starbucks starts making life hell for everyone involved in those campaigns, firing them for the flimsiest reasons, watching them like hawks, looking for an excuse to fire them, or closing down their stores. Have we been donating to those hardship funds? Have we been showing up to those Starbucks picket lines? We need to actually, there's no one coming to save us. It's only us. But if we actually show up for one another, that is what is going to put fear into the hearts of the bosses and the politicians. That, I think, is what could tip the scales, is if people actually show up and keep showing up until we win.
Yeah. If I had my soundboard here, I would press the applause button, Max, after you finish. Look, I've kept you all here over the hour, and I don't want to, exploit your time here. I do just want to pick up on one thing that was mentioned before that I forgot to follow up on, which I think it was Justin. You mentioned the 92 rail strike. What happened there? My understanding is that it was not what I guess we would consider a successful strike, that they were, coerced back to work. What can you briefly let us know what happened there and what would have to happen differently to have a different outcome this time around?
So that was sort of a, and I'm going to be honest, I don't actually know what the reasons for that strike were. I just know that it happened, and essentially what happened there was they let it go for 2 days, and then once staffers stopped showing up to work because the MARC train was not running because it was run by CSX, some congressmen got mad and they forced everyone back to work, which is annoying because it's kind of petty. But
how did they force everyone back to work?
Same way they're doing it now.
So they actually passed a resolution to force them.
Yes, that was the congressional action to force everyone back to work. Yeah. So this is something which has happened before, in fact, multiple times.
I see. Well, okay. Well, hopefully there's some lessons to be learned from the past. I really do appreciate all three of you taking so much time with me today. I think this has been a really great episode. I can't imagine a better panel. Ross, can you tell folks briefly where to find you and all of your work around this stuff, and also any funds? I think you mentioned, and we put in the liner notes last time, a place where people could donate if they wanted to support rail workers.
Yeah, you can follow me at Ross Grooters, RossGrooters, on Twitter. I also recommend at Railroad Workers. Railroad Workers United would be, we're a cross-class solidarity organization of railroad workers and our supporters. You can make a donation there if you'd like to support our work. And thanks for having me on a second time. It's great to be a part of an extended podcast universe.
I love that. The podcast MCU. Good stuff. Max, can you let people know where to find you?
Sure, and thank you, again for having us on, Bree. Really appreciate it. You can find me as long as Twitter's around. I'm at Maximilian, 2 L's, MAXIMILLIAN _ALV. Please follow and support the Real News Network, where I'm the editor-in-chief, where we have been doing our best to cover the crisis on the railroads all year by publishing in-depth interviews with actual workers. So please support that work so we can keep doing it. You can go to therealnews.com/support and check out my podcast, Working People, and I guess my book, The Work of Living, if you're looking for something to read.
Love that. Please do. And Justin, I'm going to go to you in a second. But, follow these podcasts. It helps boost them in like the Apple algorithm to follow. Leave a comment. Follow the YouTube pages, like the videos, write comments in the videos, all of those things. I understand that, times are tight and that it's not always possible to subscribe and things like that. But those little things matter. Retweeting it when you see it on the timeline. Please do support everybody here on this panel. But go ahead, Justin. Where can people find you, your podcast, and your work at large?
I'm on the Bird site as who_shot_JGR. I am on the our podcast is Well, There's Your Problem. It's on YouTube. It is on anywhere fine podcasts are sold, but we have slides with the podcast, so you watch it on YouTube. You can see the visual instructions. Other than that, I'm just some guy.
Well, as some guy, you are a really great contribution to this panel. I feel so blessed. It's not exactly the right word I'm looking for, but it's like such a wonderful opportunity to be able to talk to all three of you at once today. To the audience, thanks for listening. You know where to find Bad Faith. And as always, take care of yourselves and keep the faith. Hey, YouTube. Thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.